Hello, today we'll be discussing the Parthenon located at Athens in Greece. We were discussing the history and architecture and how its construction is similar and different to Roman architecture. Let's get started. The Parthenon in its current state wasn't built from the very beginning, also known as ex novo, but rather it was considered the final monument in a series and has many as three archaic predecessors, which we'll get to in a moment. The original structure, which was built in the aftermath of the First Persian War, was a marble building that was built in a similar scale and at the same location as the current Parthenon. Its predecessor was destroyed during the Second Persian War, when the Persians returned to Greece a decade later, in which they invaded Athens and sacked the Acropolis, which is Athens' citadel, where they looted sanctuaries, burned buildings, and overturned statues, etc. And it wasn't until the Athenians returned to witness destruction, and they considered how to commemorate both its destruction and the celebration in the Persian Wars. The Parthenon's construction was done in mid-5th century BCE, and as stated before, it was built on top of the older Parthenon foundation, where they reused every block from its predecessor that hadn't been fire damaged, which saved the Athens plenty of time and expense and spared as much as 1/4 of construction costs. The sculptures of the Parthenon were not finished until 4032 BCE, even though the building itself was first done in 447 and completed in 438 BCE. The sculptures retold history of Persian wars elusively through myth that's clearest on the metapiece decorating this temple's exterior. For instance, one of them is the Battle of Lampius and Centaurs, which is like a contest between men and centaurs that recast the Persian wars as a battle between good and evil. And of course, although they didn't depict that battle as an effortless victory, they show the forces of civilization struggling, challenging, wounded, and overcoming their struggles. And in turn, it allowed Athenians to acknowledge their initial defeat and their victory in the Persian Wars, allowing them to transform history through myths. It was left in ruins from 480 to 4047 BCE, and it was a monument that directly implicated the Acropolis' sacking during the Second Persian Wars. But following its reconstruction, it became a monument that celebrated the war's successful conclusion, even though it was a terrible experience and full of suffering. The Parthenon was altered by a series of aspiring monarchs, both Hellenistic and Roman, and the goal was to pull the monument toward the contemporary instead of being the past. And they did it by having later victories with Athens' legendary struggles against the Persians. The first up is the Macedonian king Alexander the Great. And as he sought to conquer the Achaemenid Empire, he made good use of the Parthenon. For instance, after his first victory of the Persians in 384 BCE, he sent 300 suits of armor and weapons from his enemies to the Athens, which then prompted the Athenians to use them to adorn the Parthenon, which is adorned just below the metapiece on the temple's exterior, as you can see in the picture. There are faint traces of the shields currently seen on the Parthenon, and as I said before, it was placed just below on the metapiece and temple's exterior, but they were melted down a long time ago due to their valuable metal content, and those shields represent Alexander's victory as well as Athens' subordination under his rule. The second is the Hellenistic monarch, known as the Pergamene kings. They had a large and more ambitious dedication to the Parthenon, which is erected to the south of the Parthenon, in which the monument celebrated the Pergamene kings' victories over the Gauls in 241 BCE. These recent success was similar to older mythological historical victories, and other structures juxtaposing Gallic battles with those of gods, giants, Amazons, and etc. And similar to Alexander's shields, the Pergamene also made good use of this placement on the Parthenon, in which their dedication highlighted the connections between the Hellenistic monarchs and the city-state of Athens, paying homage to Athens' history while also appropriated for other purposes. The third is the Roman Emperor Nero, who has an inscription on the east facade of the Parthenon, created with bronze lettering between Alexander's shields. And with this, they recorded Athens' vote in honor of Nero, It was put up in early 60 CE, but it was taken down following his assassination 8 years later. And they did honor Nero by connecting him to Athens and Alexander as an example of being the young emperor model, but that was struck from historical records due to him being a controversial ruler. The Parthenon went through many phases and lives. For instance, it was converted into a Christian church dedicated to Theotokos, or the Mother of God. Placing a Christian church on the site during this time wasn't just pragmatic, but was also programmatic, and it provided a clear example of Christianity's victory over traditional religion. The Christians needed a large interior space for congregation compared to other religions who needed like a smaller space. And so they end up removing the interior of the statue of the Parthenon, detaching from the exterior colonnade and adding an apse that broke through columns at the east end. And most of the metopieces that were lower and more visible were cut away, though the south metopiece was spared, and the frieze was left intact, including the high-up pediments. After the Persians sacked the Acropolis, its ruins were left abandoned until the time of Pericles, and as stated before, the existing building began reconstruction in 447 BCE, and under Pericles' leadership, the Doric temple was built anew. It was longer and broader than its predecessor, with the cella divided into two separate sections. The whole building is about 100 feet long and about 34 feet wide. And it does have Ionic features, with 4 Ionic columns supporting the roof and ceilings. And because it was built on top of the older Parthenon foundation, it rests on the rock, with the frieze running above the porches and alongside of the cella. It's not surprising that the Romans were inspired by Greek architecture. For instance, the Temple of Portinus was one of them, dating back to 75 BCE, that's made of Roman tufa, which is local brownish stone, and travertine, which is white stone you can find by quarries. It only survived because it was converted into a church when Rome became Christian. Its name, Portinus, meaning the god of the port slash harbor, was dedicated to him. And in terms of the appearance, you can see the picture, it looks similar to a Greek temple. In terms of its architecture, it's similar of Greek elements. A pediment is located at the top of the entrance, a stylish element that's shared by the Greeks. It also possesses a front where most Greek temples do not really have. And at the sides, that's 6 freestanding columns at the front and a staircase going all the way around. And it has Ionic columns, as you can see, but it has scrolls at the top, identified by deep flutes and tall indentations that runs along the column shaft. Another Ionic feature is the frieze, which runs around the building, a continuous band that previously had relief sculptures, where compared to Doric structures, the frieze would be interrupted by triglyphs and metopes. Even though it has similar elements to Greek architecture, the Roman architecture still applies. For instance, at the back, it has attached columns that look freestanding, and the roof is held up by the wall. And if you remove all the columns, the roof will still hold, emphasizing the interior space rather than the idea of the Greek temple that's more like a sculpture. Its plan of construction is more of a rectangular footprint, about 10.5 by 19 meters wide, resting on a high podium with a single flight of stairs. It only has freestanding columns on its facade, with attached columns on its sides and the rear. And it also, as stated before, it was built out of Roman tufa and travertine to imitate the Greek marble. It's always fascinating to see how architecture and buildings and styles have changed over the years, and seeing how certain countries and regions, for instance, the Greek and the Romans, finding ways and be influenced by each other to create all of these types of similarities and use them to create something new.